I think from a budgeting standpoint, having a really good understanding of income and versus expenses, and then assets versus liabilities, right? So all of these things kind of interact with each other, but they're very different, right? Income can help create assets, liabilities can create expenses. So I think at a very basic level, and we don't see a lot of people do this because it's hard, right? It's hard to put pen to paper and build yourself a budget and look at what's coming in versus what's going out. And I think the easier one anyways, is the income piece, right? You can look at your W-2, you can look at what you're making at your job and see what's getting deposited even more easily into your checking account nowadays with direct deposit. The absolute hardest one that I've seen for clients of all ranges is the expenses. There are some of the predictable ones, gas for your car and rent and mortgages and groceries. But some of the one-offs are things that are unexpected, right? And that will play into my next slide on using a bucket strategy, because if one of the big mistakes I see people make is kind of lumping all their income into one bucket and paying all their expenses out of that bucket. It makes it very muddy and it makes it hard to track. So I always, a big takeaway is kind of create for your income streams and for your objectives, different silos or different buckets that you can allocate the dollars that are coming in, so it's easier to track it on the way out. And so again, income is really just anything you're out there earning or working for and getting paid for, and that could be by way of a job if you're working for a local employer. If you start a landscaping company and start to earn money as a self-employed individual, all that gets counted into income. And then expenses is anything that is going out the door, right? So again, I mentioned before, could be your car payment or utilities or food or entertainment, right? And we always, like any person or any business, you want to make sure for the long term, for it to be sustainable, is to make sure that your income is outpacing your expenses, right? There may be a time period where you see your expenses for a short time, maybe it's a week or a month, something comes up where your expenses are above your income, but that doesn't lead to a very sustainable strategy, because everything from expenses as well, you want to think of it from, yes, it's a thing we have to pay to put food on our table, to put a roof over our head, to put gas in our car, but also I would put into that line of on the budget of savings, right? How much am I putting into my retirement account at work? How much am I putting into my emergency fund, right? All of these are subtractions against your income or your discretionary or spendable income. So as you start to do that, then you start to build assets, which are really just the things that you own. That could be a car, it could be a house, it could be a bank account, something that you can set your income aside and purchase, right? And then the liability side of that is, if you buy a car, and again, Andrew, you're going to go into this in more detail, and you can't pay cash for it, you got to take a loan, and that's going to be kind of shown as a liability. And I think that's just a very important kind of basis of the first moving parts of somebody's cash flow, if you will. So this is a very simple visual, but I really like it. I think we can get people thinking in this way. Again, on the left, you have the income coming in, and the first line up to the top is that remainder after, really your income taxes, right, that are being withheld. And if you kind of visualize that first bucket being, this is what I'm going to use to pay my basic bills, right? So my utilities, my car payment, my rent. But what happens after that? What happens if there's a surplus? And so the idea of thinking about filling that bucket up to the top And if we don't have another bucket below it to catch that overflow, a lot of times we find that money or that extra income kind of falls to the cracks, so to speak, and it gets wasted, because if it's just sitting there in that first bucket, there may be some lost opportunity cost, meaning what else could I do with that money? Whether that's save it into a high interest savings account, to investing it into a Roth IRA. And I'll go into that a little bit more. But the next bucket we always try to get people, especially young people too, is an emergency savings bucket, right? So this is the rainy day fund. And a lot of people think of this as if you're, a little bit older, or if you've got other responsibilities. But I think for somebody in high school to have some cash on the side that doesn't have a specific use other than just to be there for the unexpected expenses. And there's different rules of thumb on this. It could be, some people will say it's 6 months of expenses. I generally try to get people to think of, if that is a good first approach, right? The more conservative you are, the more you may want to have 12 months of expenses. If you're still living at home, you may, versus if you're out and you have a rent payment, right? You've got to look at what in that first bucket, what your living expenses are, and then keep 3 to 12 months of that in cash, and that's going to sit there for that emergency purpose that you might not expect. But you don't want to have to dip into, which Angela, you'll go into later, a credit card or a short-term debt to cover an unexpected expense. One example might be if you buy a car and you need maintenance on it, right? If you've got no money in your emergency fund and it's all committed to your living expenses or to your longer term, it would be very hard to come up with the funds needed to pay for that expense. So after that emergency savings bucket, what else can we do? Well, there's things like, if you got your first job, we always encourage people as young as you can get into them to look if the company you're working for has a retirement plan. And what that allows somebody to do is set money aside for the very far future, right? So this is age 60 plus money, which for somebody in high school, it might be very hard to kind of imagine that or envision, setting money aside for that, but it's never too early to start. And what you might find is your employer might say, well, you got to be 21. Well, if that's the case, that's okay, because there's other vehicles out there that, as long as you have earned income, you can set up things like IRAs or individual retirement accounts. You can set up Roth IRAs. And these, again, are that last bucket on the waterfall, if you will, because these are dollars that you're not going to be able to touch for many, many years. So that also then gives, and you see there on the side that I really kind of view short-term, 0 to 3 years, right? I know I'm going to need this money in the next 36 months, whether that's to pay for, college tuition, buy a car, buy a laptop, that you want to keep in very liquid, secure, say, in a bank, right? So savings and checking accounts. Your midterm bucket is 3 to 10 years, right? So this might be something where you say, if I'm in high school and I want to be able to buy a car by the time I'm done with college, so that's, maybe it's 5, 6, 7 years away, you can save a little bit differently into that midterm bucket. And then that long-term bucket, again, is that 10+ year money. That's the retirement dollars. Or if you've got a goal that, hey, after college, I want to be able to, put a down payment on a house, but I want to start allocating some dollars today, you can start to do that. So, and there are tools out there that are very user-friendly. It could be as simple as an Excel sheet, putting what your income is into that and lining up and putting in to the best you can your expenses, and start to look at a lot of times what we look at is, instead of mandating a dollar amount, because sometimes that gets a little too rigid, is a percentage, right? So somebody might say, look, I'm going to take 50% of my income or 60% of my income and allocate that to the living expenses bucket. I'm going to take 20% of my income and allocate that to the emergency savings bucket. And I'm going to take the other 20% and allocate it to, the third and fourth bucket. And I think that's a good way to approach it. So you're not always locked into a dollar amount. Angie, I don't know if you'd add anything there.
No, I think one thing I will say is a lot of young people, when they're starting out, kind of forget about income taxes with their first job. So I think that's a thing to think about. So although you might make a certain amount and you're kind of thinking of what your expenses are, incorporating those income taxes or a little bit that's going to be taken out of your check also is a good idea.
That's a great point, because as you get your first job and you get your first, you got to file your first, what's called your W-4, is you have to make some elections and you'll have that income tax withheld. But you want to make sure, to Angela's point, that that's, not too little or too much. And I think that's something, absolutely, Angela, that people don't pay attention to and can be a surprise.